You know, you got to give it to him that he's even coming to the council meeting.
Yeah.
2 days after his wedding.
Did you get his text?
I know. Allie's a saint. I didn't realize my microphone was.
And Scott Preston.
Yeah, exactly.
Call to order a meeting for the Normal Town Council for September 16th, 2019. Please call the roll.
Mayor Coos?
Here.
Mr. McCarthy?
Here.
Mrs. Cummings?
Here.
Mr. Nord?
Here.
Ms. Smith?
Here.
Mrs. Lorenz? Here. Mr. Preston?
Here.
We'll begin with a pledge of allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We begin tonight with public comment. We have 8 people who want to speak tonight. Just to remind you, I take the request to speak in the order in which they were received. Because we do have a number, I'm reminding you that there's a 3-minute limit on your comments, so please honor that so we can get on to the business of the meeting. First speaker is Craig Stimpert.
Thank you, Mayor. My name is Craig Stimpert. I live here in Normal, Illinois. Tonight we are going to hear a financial report from Andrew Hune about the financial condition of our town. And I think this would be a good time to address an ongoing concern of mine, and that is the funding for our police and fire pensions. Currently, our fire pension fund is funded only to 61.84%, and our police pension fund is far worse at 55.88%. These low levels of funding come after years of property tax increases to the homeowners in Normal, and the sad result is we're just not seeing any forward momentum in the funding levels of these pensions. That's because we are dealing with problems associated with a defined benefit type plan in which the taxpayers are on the hook for funding the shortfall. And as one who has advocated for a pension reform in the state of Illinois for many years, this is where it has to begin. Our state lawmakers need to begin the process of transferring these funds into a 401k style defined contribution plan where there's more control over the money. And I believe, and financial experts agree with me, that such a move could save the taxpayers hundreds, thousands, possibly even millions of dollars, and it would put the pension holder in a much better position in the long run with his retirement portfolio. That is where pension reform needs to begin on the local level. But more importantly tonight, we need to look at needed reforms here on the local level in Normal. There is a widespread misunderstanding in the town of Normal that pensions must be funded through a property tax levy. And we need to understand that this is a long-standing precedent in the town of Normal. It's been decided by previous councils, and it is a choice that this council chooses to follow. It is a choice. It is not a state mandate. Now, I know at the last tax hearing, back in December of 2017, Councilmember Cummings, you read for us a statute, and you seem to imply from your reading that there is no other way to fund these pensions than by raising my taxes. And I have a copy of that statute here tonight. I'm not going to read it, but I do want to direct our attention to a clause in that statute that speaks of revenues available from other sources, and I'm quoting from the statute. We need to understand, well, what are they talking about in this statute when they talk about revenues available from other sources? Well, obviously, they're referring here to money that finds its way, one way or another, into the general fund. Now, why would this revenue from other available sources be a problem in the town of Normal? I think we know the answer to that question. This is a matter of priorities. These pensions are not part of the city budget. When you don't budget for them, you have to rely on a tax levy. This is a long-standing precedent in the town of Normal, and it's just not working. Our pensions are grossly underfunded, and relying on a property tax increase is not going to get them where they need to be. We need to do the math. You're going to have us taxed out of our homes before we get there by the year 2040. So I want to encourage this council to take a serious look at the matter. The tax increasing madness has to stop. I have every reason to believe we're going to be back here in December with another tax increase hearing. I'm not expecting a rebate like the one that was handed out the last council meeting. I'm expecting another increase, and that is not only unacceptable, it's unsustainable. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Patrick Hoban.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. My name is Patrick Hoban. I'm the CEO of the Bloomington Normal Economic Development Council, and I wanted to follow up on the last meeting. Councilman Nord actually asked about the EDC's opinion when it came to Fiala Brothers Beer LLC project. That's something that I had not had a chance to look at, but I have reviewed the packet since then and want to just weigh in. Basically, looking at it, you got a 9.4% project coverage, which is well within the range of what the national average is. Normally for a project, we're looking for about 20% coverage, so this is coming in under 10, which is fantastic. It's also a pay-as-you-go, so this is not anything up front. This is basically they have to perform in order to get something back. And it's also just on the sales and food and beverage and not on the TIF, even though it's in a TIF. So I think this is a win across the board without diving too far into the actual numbers of what the TIF increment could generate. But you're addressing a vacancy, you're increasing your TIF increment, you're assisting a manufacturer, but also not only any manufacturer, it's one of your own, and it's also improving the quality of place. Last time go around, I believe they said people don't travel for this. This is something that actually my family does. We go on brew tours, we go out of town, we hit Champaign. We like to go around and try the local beverages, so I'm looking forward to enjoying these as well. Thanks.
Next speaker is Dave Shields.
Hi, I'm Dave Shields. I live at 701 Broadway in Normal. Look for it on the cover of the Home Market this weekend. About 5.5 months ago, in our most recent municipal election, 81% of Normal's registered voters were happy enough with the town's services, quality of life, finances, and safety, and the future thereof, that they expressed their pleasure by staying home. And the majority of the votes that were cast came from folks who agreed and wanted to assure future success. 55% of votes cast went to 5 candidates with actual experience and involvement in moving Normal forward, and another 5% went to a candidate referred to as a progressive, as in working for progress. I think the financial trend and condition report we're going to hear about affirms and validates that overwhelming majority perspective that things are really good. Not perfect, but getting a little better pretty much every day. The report is going to make the point that Normal doesn't exist in a vacuum and does not control everything, which affects any municipality's finances, but because of its conservative approach, the time-tested forecasting and budgeting, which has been standard operating procedure for decades, Normal is a standout example of how to get the things it can control right. The things which are in the town's operational control in terms of budgeting and spending, they excel at. Full stop. I suspect that we're going to hear a rehearsed reimagining of the facts to try to prove otherwise. It's almost as if there's a contest to see who can twist things into the most dire and apocalyptic interpretation possible, replacing context with some manufactured parallel world. But the majority of folks in town, the moderates, the progressives, the realists, see through that, and they ain't buying it. The Financial Trend and Condition Report is a trusted, clear-eyed assessment based in data and years of experience. And that assessment is thanks to the hard work, honesty, and integrity of people whose jobs are to make it all happen. It looks like things are really good. Not perfect, but getting a little better pretty much every day. And Ms. Reese, please thank everybody for that, too.
Next speaker is Carl Silo.
Good evening. I'm sure some members mentally rolled their eyes seeing when
Carl,
I
if you
was
just
here.
state,
Pardon?
just state your name for the
Oh, I'm
record,
sorry,
please.
Carl Sila. Thank you. I'm sure some members mentally rolled their eyes seeing I was here once again to represent the views of a good number of Normal citizens, since I'm usually such a naysayer. But tonight, I'm actually here as a yay-sayer of sorts. I would like to see the council vote yes to extending the ISU Art Gallery lease. The town's master plan has created several worthless spaces in Uptown, as measured by how much private rent they can command without giveaway of taxpayer money. And this seems like a good use for one such worthless place. I would also like the council to vote yes on the several building code waivers needed for the new brew pub. I'd like to add, however, that most or all council members claim to be pro-growth, pro-jobs, and pro-future for Normal. The brew pub seems like a great idea to me, a great business that the town's regulation environment would normally prevent from opening here. If a great business being able to open is the exception rather than the rule, perhaps the town needs to cut back on our anti-business rules so Normal can stop playing lip service and truly become pro-job, pro-growth, and pro-future. Thank you.
Next speaker is Jonathan Seiden.
Good evening, Council. Jonathan Seiden, 1100 Beach Street. I'd like to register my excitement about the Fiala Brothers Brew Pub having been many times multiplied after seeing the plans in the report for this council meeting that hopefully everyone will get to see in a little bit if they haven't already. This is an opportunity for an attractive driver of economic development in a growing industry here in Uptown, and I want to explicitly tie that to the fact that it's been made possible directly as a result of the Uptown redevelopment project and the TIF. I'd also like to register my surprise and disappointment with the council members that voted against the project development resolution last week. In my view, these votes actively and inappropriately undermine the town's public support for this project team and other project development teams that may be considering similar very positive opportunities for the town. And finally, I'd like to assure both those council members and any members of the Fiala Brothers Brew Pub team that are present that I greatly look forward to responsibly doing my part to reaching the Brew Pub's tax incentive ceiling as soon as possible.
Next speaker is Davy Rivers.
My name is Davy Rivers, and I am a college student here at ISU, and I am also a resident of a First Site apartment. And I would like to bring to the council's attention the blatant disregard for the recycling ordinance that the First Site company has been showing. We have a group of my friends and I have been calling their offices to ask about it, and some answers we have received have included they are opting out. They are arguing that it is in fact not a law, and they will currently not, and in the future not be offering any recycling. We've also called the city a couple of times to talk about it, and around 3 weeks after it was enforced, we were told that they were not enforcing it yet. To me, that seems a little ridiculous, considering it had been passed far earlier this year, so the companies would have had time to plan for it and to know it was coming, and that it just seems like they're letting a very large corporation get away with breaking the law. I, for one, am very pro-recycling. In fact, I just came from an environmental meeting on campus, so I'm very pro-environment. And it's disappointing that I have to hold all of my recycling in my apartment, just letting it pile up in the corner, waiting for the day that potentially First Site will allow me to recycle. Thank you for your consideration.
I should point out when people sign up to list, and no one did tonight, the agenda item that they wanted to talk on. That was kind of our rules. Mr. Rivers, your topic wasn't on the council, but you're new to this process. I let that go. But again, our public comment is tied to agenda items, so I'd ask that you write that down on the sheet when you sign up and honor that. Our next speaker is Mark Teratilli.
Good evening, everyone. Mark Teratilli, 1212 Timber Ridge Court here in Normal. Thank you for the time. I want to start out by thanking the town for the support of the household hazardous waste recycling event. That is a really important event. As an environmental science teacher, I can tell you how important it is to keep those things out of standard landfills and to send them to the appropriate place. So thank you for that. Thank you for the Ecology Action Center and their great work there. A couple of rebuttal points. I, too, am looking forward to the Fiala brothers. However, if a 10 to 20% underwriting of a business project that is going to bring so many benefits to the town is so fantastic, why stop there? Why aren't we doing that across the board for every business in the community? I mean, if it generates so much more, then we should be multiplying the effort. And of course, the answer is we can't afford it. So I would like to see incentives in the future that are either approachable by everyone or by no one. I don't like the singling out of incentives, but I am looking forward to the brew pub. I want to comment on one other previous speaker. The previous election, Stan Nord got 2,928 votes out of 5,520. The only candidate to receive a true majority of the people casting a vote, 54%. The next furthest candidate was nearly 800 votes behind and over 5 percentage points back. So Mr. Nord actually did manage to pull a majority of this community into his camp. The real reason I'm here tonight is I want to speak about Connect Transit and the lack of an appointment to the board. It's time to appoint someone. I know you're waiting for
Mr. Teratilli, that is not an agenda item tonight, so I'm going to ask you to hold that, and you can certainly call me or any member of this council to have that discussion. I certainly understand your position and other people's position on that, but that is not an agenda item tonight.
I have contacted you a couple times. I will disagree with you for a couple of reasons. One, we've had a lot of other people speak off agenda. It is in the bills for reporting and approval. I know for certain that it will be spoken about tonight under comments and concerns. So on top of that, we have clear case before the Attorney General. We're waiting for their ruling on this very item. The training for all council members on the Open Meetings Act has an example that speaks just to that and says that because the council members under our open discussion can talk about anything, so can the public. So for those reasons, I'm going to continue, and I would like to ask you to credit the time that we've spent discussing this. So while I understand that you're waiting for the working group to finish their results, the current board of Connect Transit is not.
Again, Mr. Tilly, this is not an agenda item. So again, meet me afterwards, talk to any members of the council, talk to the press. It's not an agenda item tonight.
All right, you are the chair. I will abide by your ruling. I strongly disagree, and I did contact you 2 weeks ago, and I'm still waiting for an appointment on this
Thank you.
very issue. Thank you very much.
We move to the omnibus agenda, items considered routine in nature and will be handled as one vote unless a council member would like to pull an item for discussion. I would like to be excused from voting on any bills I may have incurred in my duties as mayor. Ms. Smith?
I'd like to pull the minutes, item D.
I'm sorry, you're going to have to speak. I'm sorry.
Sorry, I forgot to turn my mic on. Pull the minutes, item D and item E.
Thank you. Mr.
I would like
Norton?
to pull item B and item C.
Another omnibus agenda well covered. Thank you. We have no omnibus votes tonight, so the first item of business is approval of the minutes of the regular council meeting of September 3rd, 2019. Ms. Smith?
Move the approval of the minutes for the regular council meeting of September 3rd.
Thank you. Do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you. Ms. Smith?
I respectfully request that the minutes be amended to incorporate some expanded discussion of some comments I made after following the presentation by Mr. Weber of PGAV, where there was this.
You'd hold that for just 1 second. We have a motion to amend the minutes, so I'd need an approval or a motion on that one, please. I'm trying to tighten up our process here a little bit.
I second.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Did we have a motion and a second on an amendment of the minutes?
Yeah, Ms. Smith made the motion.
Okay. Correct me if I'm wrong here, Mr. Day, but I'm thinking I needed to consider the amendment separately and then vote on the minutes. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah, we first have the motion to approve
Gotcha.
the minutes.
Okay.
Has been made and seconded, and then Ms. Smith made the motion to
All right.
the amendment. So we are now on the amendment.
Ms. Smith? Go ahead with your point. I'm sorry.
So I respectfully request that the minutes be amended to incorporate a more expanded discussion of my conversation with Mr. Weber of the PGAV Consulting Group to emphasize that according to an alternative calculation of the funding for the TIF project, that public financing approached 43% instead of the 30% that he stipulated. And likewise with the follow-up to the auditor's report, I wanted to emphasize that her audit report included a provision that in the intergovernmental agreement, our communities do provide support needed to offset any operating losses, and I'm particularly wanting to get that into the minutes because I understand that the working group has created a focus on sustainability, and I wanted to have on the record that a mechanism already exists to sustain this service, but the current funding levels, as was evident in an earlier presentation by Connect Transit, provided information to the council that our current funding levels are not triggering the full scope of matching dollars that are available, and that's why I wanted those specific items in the minutes.
Thank you. I'm not supportive of that motion, and the reason is that the minutes are taken by the clerk, and the clerk is trained on how to write minutes, and this is the type of minutes we've been writing for years. What you've just asked for, I don't quite understand because it doesn't reflect exactly what you said. It reflects a philosophy of what you said. And also because we have verbatim video of everything that was said. People can reference that as part of the process. Now we can.
Point of order?
Let me finish, please. We can, if this council wishes, we can have those minutes, those council meetings recorded verbatim and translated. But I can tell you that will come at no small cost.
Point of order. If I could direct a question to the town attorney, that my understanding is that in a court of law, the minutes are taken as a standalone document to provide an official record of transactions that occur at council meetings, and absent any other desire to look at supporting alternatives, that it would be my contention that the minutes should be a little more expansive than they are in their present form.
Certainly, I'm not sure what you mean by court of law. We've got two documents that govern the requirements for our minutes. One is Robert's Rules of Orders, which we've adopted under our ordinance, and the second is the Open Meetings Act. Under Robert's rules, it's Rule 47 is no discussion. You're supposed to record what happened, not who said what, under a strict Robert's Rules interpretation, and that's generally observed across the board. We expand it more under Open Meetings Act requires a summary of a discussion for anything that's deliberated or decided, which in this case would be anything that a vote was taken on. There's no requirement under the Open Meetings Act with respect to any presentation where basically it was just a presentation to council without any action being taken, any deliberation or decision by the council. So there are no requirements for discussion under the Open Meetings Act in that case. Again, we've got the verbatim record, the video in a court of law. It would be the minutes plus any other circumstances involving any vote that was taken. I don't think it would be the exact minutes. Now, the minutes are meant to be the official transaction of anything that was decided. We want to be careful with the minutes, one, because when you start putting in a lot of comments, you can create confusion by implying that some comment changed the decision that was made when it may or may not have. The other big issue that we look at is subjectivity. The overall goal, certainly in staff in preparing the minutes, is we want to maintain subjectivity, not insert our own opinions as to what may or may not have happened at the meeting. The best way to do that is, again, the high-level discussion. We'll talk about the points that were made without getting into this council member said this council member rebutted this, turning it into more of a transcript. Finally, the issue is we want to make sure that we are not crossing any political lines. We're clearly in campaign season at the moment, and we try to observe strict lines for anybody using any type of town resources to further any electoral politics. We want to make sure that people aren't using minutes as a campaign speech outlet. And so that needs to apply to everybody across the board. So that's some of the issues that we look at when we're creating the minutes.
I take issue with the response because, having worked in the context of businesses when they are subject to lawsuits, that the minutes are required to be a standalone document. And I also take issue with any implication that I am campaigning for anything.
Fair enough. Further discussion on the item. Mr. Nord?
As far as being subjective, if Ms. Smith feels that she needs the minutes amended for something that she said, if it is on the official video record, I see no problem adding it to the written record. If it's what she said, it's what she said. And it would be subjective for us to say that it's not relevant.
Further discussion? Mr. Preston?
Yeah, I've got one. I would just highlight for anybody watching or sitting here this evening who does not have the minutes in front of them or has not read them, that unless I am missing something in reading through these, there are not outlines of, the specific comments made by specific council members on every item. And so, frankly, if one council member is amending the minutes for specific comments from them, how minutes should be proceeded with and what the standards are and what the regulations are as to how those are approached.
Further? Please call the roll on the amendment.
Mr. McCarthy?
No.
Mrs. Cummings?
No.
Mr. Nord?
Yes, aye.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz?
No.
Mr. Preston?
No.
Mayor Kus?
No. The amendment fails, and now please call the roll on the overarching approval of the minutes.
Mrs. Cummings?
Aye.
Mr. Nord?
No.
Ms. Smith?
No.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye.
Mayor Kus?
Aye. The minutes are approved. Item B is a report to receive and file town of normal expenditures for payment as of September 11th, 2019. Mr. Nord?
I move to accept the report to receive and file town of normal expenditures for payments as of September 11th, 2019.
Thank you.
Second.
Thank you. Mr. Nord?
My question kind of echoes off of one of our residents' comments. In order to free up money from the general fund to use for other services, and also for public education, when the public has question on some of these expenses as to whether or not there were a lesser expensive option to go with, or they have recommendations, what is the process that the public should go through to let the town know of these other options?
Anyone can email me, or they could contact a department specifically if they were curious about a particular expense. These expenses for each council meeting are found online on our website, so anybody can look at the bills and find out who we paid and how much we paid in that 2-week timeline. So if anyone has any questions, they can certainly call the receptionist. She'll direct you or direct the individual to maybe an appropriate department if it's a department-specific question, or start with me.
Okay, and is there a timeline when they should be followed up on? The emails? I mean, I'm just, because I have,
Is there, if there's a specific issue or specific problem, maybe you can talk to me offline if there's something that hasn't been responded to, perhaps?
it's just for public education, like, should they be looking for a response in a week, 2 weeks, a month?
I would say probably if they don't hear something within a couple days, they could give me a call.
Okay, thank you.
Further on this item? Please call the roll.
Mr. Nord?
Aye.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye.
Mrs. Cummings?
Aye.
Mayor Kus?
Aye. The report to receive and file is approved. Item C is a resolution to amend the lease agreement for Illinois State University Art Gallery to extend the term to February 28th, 2020. Mr. Nord?
I move to accept a resolution to amend the lease agreement for the ISU Art Gallery to extend the term to February 28th,
Thank you.
2020.
Second.
Thank you. Mr. Nord?
As I understand it, this lease was, there was $1.9 million that the taxpayers paid for the build-out of the lease, or the build-out of the space. And then the leaseholder paid the town over the term of the lease $1.9 million. The question I
Mr.
have-
Nord, excuse me, I'm sorry, I didn't quite get that. Could you restart the question?
Sure. My question has to do with the accounting for the payments that have been received. It's my understanding that the terms of the lease, the town paid for the build-out. This was an as-built space that we paid for, or that taxpayers paid for, to the tune of $1.9 million for the build-out of the space. How has that build-out expense been accounted for? Is it an expense that then went against the TIF, or how is that $1.9 million accounted for?
It was not an expense that went against the TIF. It was money that we paid out of the Vehicle and Equipment Replacement Fund. And then as part of the lease agreement with the university, the rent was determined as the payback amount. So ISU made 5 annual installments to pay back that principal amount that we invested in the space, in addition to a 4% annual interest rate. And so they have chosen to pay us once a year for 5 years rather than monthly. And their last lease payment was made in March of 2019. And since that's a 12-month lease payment, it would take their occupancy through February of 2020.
So I'm still confused. There was $1.9 million that was the build-out expense, and then there's another 1.9 that we received for rent, or was the rent 0 and the 1.9 was repayment of the loan?
Well, I'll try to explain that to you. I had shared a copy of the lease agreement, and in the lease agreement, you are correct that the town paid for the build-out of the space. And your previous question in terms of how we paid for that, that was with money from the Vehicle and Equipment Replacement Fund, because that had cash available. So we paid for the expense out of that. And then each annual installment, which was considered the rent, that's how it was determined between the two parties, Illinois State University and the town of Normal, their rent amount was calculated based on that investment. And they paid that back over 5 years with interest, and that revenue to the town was deposited back into the Vehicle and Equipment Replacement Fund. Does that help understand?
So what you're saying is that the rent was bundled into the total project cost?
Well, we considered the town's investment as their rent, what they needed to pay as rent.
Plus interest.
Plus interest.
Okay.
Did that answer your question?
It kind of does. So there was 1.9 million given, we've received 1.9 million. And then it's just a matter of semantics, whether we say that 1.9 we received was repayment of this loan or went towards rent. If the 1.9 went towards rent, then that expense needs to be applied somewhere, because that was $1.9 million of taxpayer money that has to be accounted somehow. If it was for the TIF, then it was for the TIF. That's if it was an expense, that's my question. And that's just what I want I wanted clarification on.
I'm quite confident that the finance department has accounted for the money that went out 5 years ago, and then the revenue that has come in.
Which 1.9 went out, 1.9 came in.
Actually, over 2 million. It included interest.
Plus the 4% interest.
Further questions on this item? Please call the roll.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye.
Mrs. Cummings?
Aye.
Mr. Nord?
Aye.
Mayor Kus?
Aye. The resolution is approved. Item D is a resolution to accept the proposal and award a contract to Lane for drilling test wells at 3 locations within the corporate limits in the amount of $32,960. Ms. Smith?
I move the resolution to accept the proposal and award a contract to Lane for drilling test wells at 3 locations within the corporation limits in the amount of $32,960.
Second.
Ms. Smith?
I just have a few follow-up questions for clarification, and I did communicate these with Ms. Reese in advance of the meeting, but I had some other follow-up questions that I'm hoping can still be answered. I just asked that in the record that there be the clarification as to why we accepted the Lane Brothers bid. It was slightly higher than the Grosch, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, bid that was not chosen, and that I understand that this is a first step in a process to replace these wells, and I'm wondering if there's any estimate of the potential future cost to tie these new wells into the system when the wells are deemed successful and workable, and if we have a timetable of when we might expect those costs to be facing the council.
Sure. I'm going to invite Mr. Burkhart to come forward. In regard to the proposal, Lane is the vendor that we are asked council to authorize tonight, and as you pointed out, Grosch, what? It was did submit a lower number for the project, but we did not feel they were as responsive as required, and they did not submit all the information that was required to ensure that the water test was going to be a secure sample of water. And then in regard to the other things, I will defer to Mr. Burkhart.
Yes. So part of next year's budget, it'd be 2021, we have funds to replace 2 wells that are currently in Anderson Park, what we call wells 5 and 8. Right now, we have $500,000 allotted for that replacement. Included with that $500,000, if the well goes back in the park, and this is part of the reason why we're doing this test drilling, is to find the best spot to put a well to maximize that cost and get the greatest amount of water and good quality water as well. Included in that $500,000 cost to replace the well is the extension to the raw water main. So we include that with all of it. Typically, as anyone who's been on council in the past, 2 years ago, we bid well drilling as what we call a bid packet A and a B. One is to drill the well, and then the other is to construct the well house. And then part of that constructing of the well house is to tie on to our existing raw water main.
Those are the only questions I had. Thank you for the clarification.
Thank you.
Further questions on this item? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye.
Mrs. Cummings?
Aye.
Mr. Nord?
Aye.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mayor Kus?
Aye. The resolution is approved. Concludes our omnibus agenda. We have one item. Oh, I'm sorry. No, I missed one. You're right. Item E is a resolution to waive the formal bid process and accept a quote from Presidio Networked Solutions Group, LLC, in the amount of $112,443.42 for the purchase of body camera video storage and protection and related services. And Ms. Smith, you don't have to repeat that. You can just move approval.
I move approval of this
Thank you.
item.
Second.
It was a mouthful for me, so I didn't want to hand that to you. Ms. Smith.
So in reviewing the documentation, it indicated that it did require storage, and I understand that there will be 2 sites, one in our existing town offices and another off-site. Is there going to be any requirement for modification to ventilation or anything to accommodate the computer equipment, or will our existing air conditioning systems provide the rooms at an appropriate temperature for these servers?
Both the locations are ready to accept the equipment, so there will be no additional charges associated with accommodating these servers.
That's all I needed. Thank you.
Further? Please call the roll.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye.
Mrs. Cummings?
Aye.
Mr. Nord?
Aye.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mayor Kus?
Aye. The resolution is approved. Moving to general orders, one item on general orders, a resolution to approving waivers from the Uptown Design Review Code, Chapter 15, Division 17, for 127 East Beaufort Street, having to do with the Fiala Brothers Brew House. Motion for approval, please.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. Before we go into discussion, I think staff has a very brief overview of what the waivers are and what they might look like and the reasons for them. Thank you.
Sure. So some illustrations were provided in the, I will not be doing the financial trend and condition report. Some really bad joke.
Andrew was feeling good for there for a second.
It's all good. It's okay. Yeah, please work your magic. This project is at 127 East Beaufort, and many of you would recall this was a one-story building. It's been there for several decades. Most recently was Bill's Lock and Key for many years. They've relocated to a property outside of Uptown, and they sold the property to the Fiala brothers, who would like to build this brew house project. The project itself, as you've seen in your packet, is now going to be a two-story building. They were originally just going to do some heavy remodeling of the one story and add a second floor, but it's a little bit in the weeds to even tell you this. Basically now all that's going to be left is the east wall. So the wall you see on the left side there is going to be original. The building will be primarily masonry, a lot of glass, some architectural metal panels. As you can see in this image, which faces Beaufort, there will be a fairly deep outdoor patio on the second floor. There's another one on the back side of the building, and I can just kind of arrow to the back, which is there, a smaller patio on the back. Some features of the building that are a bit unique, the sign package, both on the front and the back, there will be a pretty significant piece of metal that will have the lettering cut out, and then there will be some backlighting behind it, so that's gonna look really sharp. But other than that, you can see that the front side, the front facade there on the first floor sits back a couple feet from the front edge of those wing walls on the side. That's how Bill's Lock and Key was for many years, and they're choosing it to do it the same way for structural reasons. They have the large garage door-ish looking window on the front, which they hope will be operable. That's the plan. And yeah, I think those are the primary just architectural features. There are a few variances noted in the report, and as I say on any new project in Uptown, there's always going to be a little list of variances. And the commission that reviews this includes 3 architects and a retired art professor and some other people with experience in Uptown. For this particular project, the variances included for the front entrance. Technically, the door should be set back far enough that it does not open out past the front property line at all, so that it doesn't swing onto the sidewalk. This door is pretty much in the same location as the original Bill's Lock and Key door, so it's going to swing out onto the sidewalk in exactly the same manner it always has for decades. It'll be about a little over a foot out past their property line. As far as windows go, there's a requirement for a certain amount of window coverage on the second floor, 30 to 50% to be specific, and their window coverage falls a little short of that on the second floor. Although, as the commission noted, this is such a non-traditional or unconventional second floor, it doesn't really function as a second floor facade that you'd see on a historic building. It sits back 24 feet. You can't even really see it except from, you can see the top of it from across the street. So the commission was comfortable with that variance. As far as vertical orientation goes, the code is looking for more vertically oriented windows on the front facade of buildings, because that's typically how historic buildings were built. In this case, because they've chosen this garage door looking window design, it doesn't really technically meet the vertical orientation. They could do it if they added some kind of fake vertical elements just to force it to meet code, but the commission really liked this design and thought it was appropriate, and so they were fine with the variance. The height of the cornice is technically a little too high, so if you go up to just under that patio, it's a couple feet taller than code calls for. That's primarily due to the configuration of the inside of the building. They've got a first floor, and then they've got this mezzanine, and then a second floor. It's kind of complicated, but it does make that first floor a little taller, and I think they also wanted it to have that feeling of a big open space with a higher ceiling, kind of a little bit of an industrial feel. So, but it requires a variance. There is an anti-monotony clause in the code to prevent big blank stretches of building, especially like adjacent to a highly visible part of your building. Now, the code doesn't say especially when it's highly visible. It just says you're not supposed to have more than 15 blank feet. Along the back side, or along the side, you can see here on that east side of the architectural metal panels are an uninterrupted length of like 60 feet. And so we talked about it at the meeting quite a bit, and the architects felt like, well, all the commissioners that were present thought that this material is very attractive. It's a high quality material. It's a second floor. Someday the La Bamba building next door could redevelop and be taller. You really can only see it from Linden. So on balance, they were really fine with it. They didn't want to force some doodad to be attached to the building just to break up the facade, because you could do it. I mean, you could easily slap on a few metal pieces in a vertical orientation and say, hey, I don't need a variance. But they really thought this was a better approach, so they were comfortable with the variance on that. The signs, the sign on the rear is 30 square feet, and technically it shouldn't be more than 26. So, but they were fine with that given the scale of the back of the building. And then there's a variance for scale of design, which is basically the floor heights. And for the same reason I mentioned earlier, the second floor, they're both a little taller than they're supposed to be per code. So, but it was a good discussion. The commissioners were comfortable with everything. They'd come in earlier just to show a conceptual design in February and had gotten some tips and made some changes already. So there was some nice back and forth, and everyone's pretty excited about this project.
Questions on the project? Mr. Nord.
My question's not really as much on the project as the process. But these variances, now that they've been approved, will the code change so that way the next person coming in, will they be able to do the same sort of thing and get the same variances?
No, not exactly. So we've taken a look at the code a couple times. It's been in place for about 15 years now, and we've gone back and amended it probably 3 times, but we did it significantly about 3 years ago, where we looked at the whole history of the first 12 or so years and looked at what were the variances that were consistently being given. And then there were code changes made to address those. It's only been like 3 years ago, so to go back and amend the code every time someone comes through with, this or that, it just, given that the process has worked really well up to this point, you have a public hearing, people come in, they work with the commission, it's all worked out. I don't see the commission feeling any pressure to amend the code again after just 3 years, but so they'll probably continue on this path where if someone has a variance they'd like to ask for, they can ask for it.
Is that a yes or a no?
No.
Okay.
Well,
looking at you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Further discussion on this item? Please call the roll.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye.
Mrs. Cummings?
Aye.
Mr. Nord?
Aye.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mayor Kus?
Aye. The resolution is approved. One item of new business tonight is the presentation of the fiscal year 2018-2019 financial trend and condition report. Mr. Hume.
One second.
You're not going to talk to us about Fiala Brothers, are you?
No. But I'm certain that Mercy would do a wonderful job in the trend report. Okay, thank you, Mayor and Council. I'm sorry for the delay there. Appreciate the opportunity to give this report. It's a report that finance and myself and the town are quite proud of. We enjoy putting the information together. Many of you have seen this before. It's going to be very similar in terms of the approach and process. If for anything we like consistency and comparability year to year, so we keep things generally the same. Might be a little boring, but we like to keep things the same so you can see what's going on. Some of you, this will be the first time you've seen this report, and we certainly welcome any questions you have on that. In terms of, in that vein, in terms of background, this report we've been done for well past my tenure here before I got here in '05. And it's really meant to be an opportunity to share a dialogue with the council, with the community, about what's happening in finances, what's happening with different index measurements, economic measurements. And our goal is to make it fairly readable and fairly meaningful. Any of these slides we could spend all night on, if you would like. I prefer you don't want to do that. Some we could debate in terms of the nature of what the slide's trying to tell us. But again, our goal is simply to provide a dialogue and an opportunity to see this information and get a real feel for it. I think in my professional career, I've come across a lot of colleagues, a lot of places I've worked, and no one I'm aware of is doing something like this, even close to this in terms of information. So we are very proud of it, and we support the council in terms of their support to continue going forward. So similar to previous years, the report that's before you, we have 34 indicators. These indicators we always give a positive, negative, or an unclassified rating to. Again, staff selects the rating. It certainly can be discussed. We're kind of back and forth on what it should be. We generally try to give our opinion with some information about why we chose a positive or negative rating, and then ones that are unclassified are simply there for information only. You can see by the categories that we span, community, revenue, debt service, financial strategies. So we traverse quite a lot of information in a very short period. Again, the goal is to just provide a nice snapshot, some very good history, and a little forethought going forward. This report's always been kind of a preamble to our budget process. It gives us a sense of where we stand community-wise and finance-wise going into that process, which we're actually actively involved in right now. In terms of year-to-year changes, same number of indexes, 34. Last year we had 20 positive, 8 negative, and 6 unclassified. This year we did flip one from negative to positive, that's state income tax, and I'll explain kind of the reasoning behind that when we get to that slide. Other than that, no other changes. I think to characterize the report as a good improvement is fine. We certainly have some issues to resolve. We don't hide from the problems that we see, and as this council knows, you've seen this report many times, gone through many budget cycles, and this information is something that we go after and get ahead of as best we can. I won't go through all 34, of course. I have a handful to go through. We try to pick the ones that we think are the most meaningful, although they all have a great deal of meaning, but we can address any of you that have any questions, but I'll go through not all 34, of course. The first one we always look at is assessed property value. This is the assessed value in the town of Normal. It's probably one of the primary economic indicators for the town. As you can see from this chart, we have had growth year over year since 2014. I wouldn't characterize it as a lot of growth. We had years that are not on this chart that we had significant growth. That was when a lot of development was going on. What's happening in the last few years, barring the recession, is kind of a steady, methodical increase in overall EAV. We have changes in companies all the time in terms of ownership and EAV value. What drives the growth right now is essentially new development. We don't necessarily have kind of this underlying increase in overall asset value or EAV. It depends on the market, of course. Home prices have grown a little bit with existing homes. New prices have come down a little bit. So generally speaking, when you see an increase in the EAV, you're looking at new development. Over the years, we typically see about $8 million of new EAV every year come on the rolls. This last year was a little more significant. We had about $12.5 million come on the rolls. A couple new apartment complexes got full value. The Radisson got full value. Uptown 1 got full value. So all those things, as economic development occurred, it increased the EAV. Talking to the county for 2019, we're not seeing as much in the pipeline as we have this last year. So I suspect, and this is a relevant number for the property tax levy I'll be coming back to you in probably November, late October, early November, to talk about. We're probably going to be fairly conservative on the growth for 2019 in terms of that EAV. Likely 1% is probably going to be where we're at, and that might be a little too aggressive, but we'll see. We continue to watch that more closely as we get closer to property tax levy time. I work a lot with the county treasurer and township treasurer to find out, treasurer assessor, to find out where we're at with those numbers. Airport usage, this was another pleasant surprise. It's been one that I've come before you many, many years in the past and said negative and keeps getting worse. There's no way to spin this. It's just bad. But it has changed this last year, which is nice to see. We kind of track some of the activity in terms of airlines coming and going and new routes coming on. And Sierra staff are real helpful in terms of giving us information about what's happening in the industry. Really, it's been an interesting process to kind of work through some of the information on this and what it means. As you can see from the chart, many years of decreases, which we've been tracking for a long time, as council knows. This last year, we had a nice increase, almost 10%, 9.15%. That's the first in a long time. In talking to Sierra staff, they're also seeing pretty good growth for 19. So we do have this grade as negative still, even though we have kind of one good year, and that's really the wording. One good year does not make a good trend. However, we are positive about it. So we honestly, if we see next year at this time, we see another positive or something at least a little above that last year, then I think we might start changing our tune, maybe a positive with caution, we can use or so forth. But that's where we're at with the airport, and it's looking promising for this last year and looking good for the current year. Amtrak, a little different story. That one's kind of up and down, as you can see over the years. The down since 2014, 15, and 16, that was mostly related to track interruptions for the high-speed rail construction. That completed, and then when 2017 came, we thought, well, we'll see a bump because those tracks have been installed. It's done. And we did see an increase. We saw a bit of a drop this year, which was a little interesting. Not raising the red flag yet on that. The trend has been fairly okay in terms of where that's at. We knew why it dropped. It made sense, and the drop was obviously creating the high-speed rail service. Once that's fully implemented, we'll tend to see more growth in terms of that ridership. So right now we're positive with caution on that particular index. Unemployment, also, holding steady. It has bumped up across the board for all of our peer governments that we compare against. We went up to 4.5 this year. We typically would kind of be, number one, if you will, in terms of the lowest unemployment among our peers. Champaign has the honor this year. But anything in the fours, I think most people would recognize is a good unemployment rate to have. The town's always stayed traditionally in a pretty good condition, as well as some of our peers. One item of note is we do take this measurement kind of once a year in March with the fiscal year end. So it's a snapshot, and there's a seasonality to unemployment, as you're I'm sure all well aware of. So we did do a little more research, since we did see a kind of a bump up, which we had heard was kind of coming. We saw it across the board for all of our peer organizations. So we pulled some data. Just this slide's a little busy and a little creative and a little artistically colorful. But what it's trying to tell you is it's got 3 years of unemployment rates by month. The red is 2018, and the green is 2019, and the 2017 is blue. So we measure that in March, and you can see compared to previous years, we were higher than the 2 years. If you kind of fast forward to the latest information available from the state, we're below the other 2 years. So it really kind of gives you a flavor for where that moves around. It might depend on when you actually pick the time to do it. It might be useful to do more of an averaging on this index, we'll see, but we've always kind of traditionally picked March as the time period. And again, I don't want to over-explain what we're doing here with this rate. It's a good unemployment rate. It's in line with what we're seeing with our counterparts, And as you can see, there's some seasonality there. It just depends on when you pick that number. County workforce. This one is a little more troubling and a little more challenging to kind of unravel. As you can see, we've been tracking this for a while, and this is no surprise to the council. We looked at this many times to understand what's going on. We have had significant, I guess not significant, I would say a continual drain or decrease in this workforce. Workforce is, of course, the people working and the people actually looking for work. It's kind of interesting. We do rate it as negative, because clearly it's negative. No one's going to deny that. And what we did recently is we kind of looked back to get a little more of a historical perspective. So if you look at just this chart, this shows a little more years. This is the chart that you just previously saw to show back from 2019 or calendar year 2009 to 2018. But if you look back a little further, you can see that we're, kind of coming down to where we used to be, and this is where we really start to get a little challenged in trying to understand what's going on. I can tell you what I've heard and what I've seen, and when I've talked to colleagues and folks from regional planning. If you look back over this timeline, and again, this is just kind of what we've been able to discern from the information. From probably the early to mid 2003 to, my stuff is so small I can barely make it out. About 2010, if you recall, State Farm was in a significant kind of a ramp up of their business model and changing how they do business. They hired what we refer to as a lot of externals during that time period, and it developed quite a large workforce in Bloomington Normal that kind of crept up over several years. And then once that project was completed, that workforce was released, and we started draining down again. So part of me, and again, this is just a personal opinion or professional opinion or our best educated guess, part of me is saying that perhaps some of this growth that we're dropping off of was somewhat artificial in terms of its permanence. And are we returning to the regular level of workforce for this community? That may or may not be the case. Clearly in 2015 with Mitsubishi closing, that also added some stress to the workforce numbers. So right now we're still above our low point in 2004. And I'm not trying to suggest that we shouldn't even worry about this anymore. It's all going to be fine. We simply want to give more perspective in terms of some of the history here and try to analyze what's happening with some of these numbers. Again, it is a problem. It's problematic to see a workforce decrease. Part of me thinks that we're coming off of an artificial high, but really we need to keep tracking this every single year, keep asking questions on why it's happening, and then check the history to see how close we get to that low point, and then see what's happening. We also, as part of this, and we track
Mr.
it
Dean,
off.
I would throw in another thing
Please.
that's happening nationwide, is the retiring of baby boomers.
Right,
There's
right.
less people in the workforce as a result of that.
Yeah, and that's actually a perfect segue, because my next slide is going to talk a little bit about that. Again, we're talking about just our best educated guess at what's happening. We do sometimes, well, more than sometimes, track activity against certain revenue sources. This chart is one we've done off and on for many years. And the red line is essentially just the workforce numbers that you just saw in the bar chart on the last slide. And the blue line is the state 1% sales tax. So you can see what we saw in the 2000 to 27. We had a pretty good growth on average in sales tax, about 4.62% during those years. And what we saw in workforce was what you think it correlated quite nicely to that sales tax, which you would expect. Then, of course, we had the recession, and things flattened out in terms of workforce, and certainly, and we saw that a lot in different activity revenues, food and beverage, hotel, motel, sales tax, income tax, those things all struggled through those years. And then after that, we're kind of back down to 2.21% growth. So, what does that tell us? It's hard to say. Consumer spending is a unique animal to analyze. But certainly after the recession, people are spending maybe a little more conservatively. Again, I'm not an economist, but this is kind of what the data is saying. But the real surprise of this chart is simply that over the period of about 2010 to now, we see the workforce dropping off, but we don't necessarily see the correlation with sales tax dropping off. And why is that? And that's a good question. One for an economist and an accountant and a PhD and so forth. I have talked to regional planning folks and other colleagues, and what we've tend to think there is one, wages have increased over the years, hourly rates have increased over the years. Folks are retiring and leaving the workforce, but staying here and they continue to invest and spend. So that might be part of that offset. Now, clearly, if a workforce continues to drop off, then you're going to see revenue impact eventually. But right now, we're seeing what appears to be unique in terms of that situation. And of course, it's the whole time period, about 2.88% annual average increase per year for the state, the 1%. That's kind of the community level numbers that we look at. There's other ones we also review, home prices and permits for building material and so forth, but those are the kind of things we wanted to highlight today or tonight. Revenues, this chart's really just for information only. It essentially shows, it gives you a sense of the diverse revenue cycles we do have, and also the relative reliance we have on sales tax, which is very typical for a city. School districts rely heavily on property tax. Cities rely heavily on sales tax and income tax, and part of that shows you a sense of how much is going from various areas. Local sales tax 18%. State sales tax 10%. Water's got a piece. That's the water bill, of course. So that gives you a sense of the overall volume and diversity of the revenue sources that we have in town. State income tax. Okay, this one's a little, again, just is a unique revenue source for a lot of reasons. One, it's a significant source for us. And it's one that the state tends to play with the most over the last few years, which this council is well aware of. We did rate this. We have 1 year up, 7.1% over last year, 2 down years there, 11.3, 4.1 for the last 2 years, 17 and 18, and then 19 had 7.1% increase, which is nice to see. We rate it positive with caution, and the point is there, well, we had just had 1 good year on a kind of a downward trend. What's the situation? Where's the opinion coming from there? Well, I want to back up a little bit and talk a little bit about what the state has done. And so if we pull that chart onto this page, and the blues are the actual that you just saw on the last page. As you know, the state for 2 years took 10% of our state shared income tax, which was a huge hit in that fiscal year to deal with. And then they moved it from 10% to 5% for 18-19. And from what I hear from the state now, they passed their state budget in July of 2019. They're going to continue that 5% cut. So if you removed the impacts of those cuts from our budget, then you would see that's the red here. So you'd see without those cuts, we would have had 2 years of increase in income tax. To give you some numbers to that, 17-18, with the cut, we had 4.7 million come in. If there was no cut, we had made 5.1, almost 5.2. In 18-19, we have just over 5 million come in. Without the cut, it would have been 5.4. So really, just in those last 2 fiscal years, the financial impact of the state making those cuts to our state share, to our state income tax share in every municipalities was $740,000. I estimate it going to about $1 million in total with this next budget cycle, with this year we're in now. So this gives you a sense of I don't want to say the power of the state, but it certainly impacts us a great deal when we have the state flip a switch and say we're going to keep 10% or 5% of your income tax. It's a significant number for us to manage, and we have virtually zero control over that. But the long story there, we have 2 years. We have the actual revenue coming in, which is what we have to deal with, but the underlying economics of the state income tax is 2 years of increases of 4+%. So that's why we rate it positive, with caution though. This next slide is also kind of an information. Oh no, I'm sorry. We do actually get rid of this. This is just the property tax rate distribution slide. It just essentially shows on a rate level the total community rate, and who is essentially taking most of the property tax bill from a town normal citizen. This is no surprise. Obviously, Unit 5, most of their finances come from property tax as well as state appropriation. The town, we keep it right around 10 to 12%. Right now, we're at 11.4. That's this last rate we had for last year for 2018, and we're collecting it now. You can see the history there. We keep it right around 10 to 11%. In 2017, we were at 12%. We were kind of pushing up a little bit there with some of the property tax. 11.4 now. It's hard to say we're going to have some upward pressure in property tax. We always do. And I'll get to that in a few slides to explain kind of where that's coming from. And you'll hear about it a whole lot in October and November and December with the property tax rate levy meetings. In just terms of some comparisons across the board, this was what we consider the town rate compared to other town rates. Our counterparts, Bloomington, Springfield, Champaign, Peoria, Urbana, Decatur, and Galesburg. The town right now keeps its property tax rate for the town extremely low, the lowest in comparison to other taxing districts, other municipalities. And then also in terms of the entire rate, getting back to that pie chart that showed Unit 5, Community College, the airport, the county, and ourselves, what is our rate compared to our counterparts? And essentially, we're kind of in the bottom 4, if you will, in terms of where we stand there. So in terms of some property tax information, this is kind of a preamble to the future. As you're aware, the town has essentially 5 tax rates that make up the town rate. There's an operating rate, then we have IMRF rate, police and fire pension rate, and Social Security Medicare rate. So it's essentially the retirement piece that's driving most of this. You can see this chart here is just showing those rates broken out by levy year and where they stand. So, and it's no surprise, this is not a surprise to anyone, police and fire, the purple line and the green line, those are going to continue to grow for a lot of reasons. We'll get to some pension stuff in a little bit. And that's one area we could certainly spend a great deal of time and energy on in discussion. I'll talk about it all night long, but it's a complicated area that is both conceptual and mechanical in nature. But right now, given the current circumstance at the state and the current funding requirements, we are going to see increases in that rate to cover it. It's been like that for the last several years. IMRF. We've had some good years there in terms of the rate going down. It went down a lot in the previous year. We've had kind of a slow rate drop there, mostly in relation to the fact that it's a well-funded plan. It continues to be well-funded. We also have cut back on staff in the last budget cycles, so we're not contributing as much as we need to, as much as we are. We contribute what we're required to, but how much we need to increase that by has decreased because of the level of personnel cost. That's not going to be the same for next year. We are going to see a requirement to bump that rate a little bit, and I'll explain that in a little while, but in terms of a preamble, IMRF, like us, goes through a process to judge its assumptions on its actuarial analysis. And they decided last year to reduce their interest rate assumption for their pension funding. And when you do that, it hits your contribution and you have to make it up there. It's something you need to do to align your expectation with what the market's going to deliver over the next 10, 15, 20, 30 years. But it automatically hits everyone's funding level. Funding levels drop, we need to increase the rate to make it up. And I'll show them more when we get into that slide.
Andrew, are you going to briefly explain that formula in terms of pension funding, just as a reminder?
Sure.
There are a couple of, and actually Mr. Weber kind of went over it last time in terms of kind of tax rate, but in terms of pension funding, the formula is built off of the employer's contribution, the employee's contribution, and the interest rate assumptions. And all of those 3 parts of the formula have to add up to the total pot that we're trying to achieve in terms of the pot of funds in the pension. So when you lower the interest rate assumptions, your pot stays the same, but if you lower the interest you expect to earn, then you got to make it up at either of the other two parts of the formula, either the employer share or the employee share. And the employee share is determined by code, and that doesn't change. So it means the employer share has to change.
When did they make this change?
They made this last year.
Yes, current year.
2018.
Yep. And I'll provide a little more detail on that when we get to the pension slides. Pam, I can add some more comments to that. Oh, sorry. Okay, there we go. So back on other revenue, utility revenue, again, this was a little bit of a surprise considering the history. Utility tax revenue the town collects, there's 4 components, telephone, cable, gas, and electric. Gas and electric are generally weather dependent. If we have a hot summer and a very, very cold winter, we usually see pretty nice utility tax. If we have the direct opposite, we see not so much utility tax. However, we have been seeing a drop in all the areas, mostly, in terms of the HVAC and AC systems. They're improving in terms of efficiency. Houses are being built more efficient. Usage is down. And our tax rate is based on usage, not necessarily an amount you pay. So if a utility increases its rate, we don't see that. In fact, we usually see the opposite because people are more conserving than that time. Phone and cable, that I've gone over in the past. Just to recap, people are moving from landlines to cell phones. They've been doing it for at least a decade now. And then the part that is taxable on a cell phone is a very small piece of the person's plan. The data package is not taxed at this rate, so as people move towards that and the data rates are smaller for talk and text, we're going to see a decrease in that. I know I was explaining to my son, a long-distance phone call used to cost money when I was young, and now it doesn't cost anything because, well, it depends where you call it, but the idea of a long-distance phone call seems to be just completely out of people's orbit on these days, and that's part of also the decrease there. And then cable, of course, is becoming more competitive. There are more. For many years, we thought where's the bottom here? Eventually, it needs to bottom out. Hopefully, given the dynamics that are changing, that might not bottom out for a while as technology changes. But we did have a slight increase. We didn't all of a sudden say, hey, we're positive now. We still feel pretty pessimistic about this revenue source, which we still have negative. I don't have any confidence we're going to see it grow. In fact, the current year numbers are making me right about that in terms of what we're seeing for utility tax. So this one I would not get overly excited about because we don't have a lot of confidence it's going to be anything significant. It will probably continue to drop off. So that's what we're still rating as negative. State and local sales tax. Again, pretty good. We're feeling pretty good about this. A couple of things to share in terms of kind of full disclosure. We've had 2 years of increases, which is nice, and those are increases based on full year impacts of rates. We had a rate increase in the local, of course. That's why you see those big numbers prior to it, 39% and 16%. But year 18 and year 19 were both full year comparisons to the rate. We did have some unique things happen to this that are kind of worth calling out. In 17-18, 3.7% increase in local sales tax. That was nice to see. However, the state gave us a pretty large payment, is what they refer to as an accelerated payment. And every year we get this payment, this extra payment, and it's usually about $25,000. Well, that year it was like $300,000 plus, so it was very awkward and very odd. We called the state to find out what was going on because we didn't want to book revenue we're not sure about, or book and they have to give it back, which would be even worse. So we contacted the state, and they have a formula where they essentially take 12 years, the average for the last 12 years compared to the previous 12 years, and they give you the difference. And it's the most bizarre law I've ever seen in my life in terms of how it works. It's been on the books for many, many decades. And it has to do with some of the changes they made back in the early, where they started collecting local sales tax for governments versus they used to by themselves. So it's still on the books, and it typically does not change. You don't get that much extra money every year because unless you have a significant increase in your income, your sales tax. Well, we did have a rate increase in that year, So 12 months at a new rate versus 12 months at the old rate generated a fairly formulatic sizable amount. So it was good, but if you pull that out, that one-time payment that's not going to happen again, at least to that size, our actual increase is about 1.2%. So really in 18 we had a 1.4% increase for income tax 1% and a 1.2% increase economically in the local. Again, both increases, but that's what we're kind of seeing between 1% and 2% every year.
Have you separately tracked the actual sales volume that this revenue was generated off of to see whether or not there's been an increasing trend, or is that relatively flat?
We don't have that. We have the data from the state that shows the overall sales that generated the income, the sales tax. We track it off and on. The state breaks it into what we call, I want to say it's SIC codes. It's something standardized industrial code. They select, it's like general merchandise, automobiles, gas stations, and there's probably about 5 or 6 codes that we look at. It's fairly useful at a certain level. What we do here at the town is we do what we call a 50-store analysis, where we take the top 50 stores that are generating 80% of the actual state sales tax and income, and I keep saying income tax, and locals tax, and analyze those directly to see what's happening. That gives us a little more meaningful information to see who's up, who's down, what's happening. And we break it into kind of restaurant quadrant, groceries, general merchandise, big box stores, small box stores, specialty stores, pharmacy. And that gives us a better sense what's happening. The state information is useful. It's rolled up pretty high level, and we kind of break that down further. So I'm not sure that answers your question, but we do look at those sales pretty closely.
Well, I was just curious as to whether or not we're actually seeing higher sales volume in our community. And looking at the population, there was a plateau of about 52,000 in the first part of the turn of the century, and now we're holding steady at around 54,500. Mm-hmm. And so I'm questioning whether or not the actual sales that are occurring are increasing at an increasing trend, or if a large part of the growth is coming from the change in the rate.
Well, the 1% sales tax rate hasn't changed in decades. So
for the state.
Right.
For the local.
But to answer your question, we are seeing growth in the 1% sales tax rate. So that would mean that there is more sales volume going on. We are seeing growth in the local rate. Generally, we extract out at that rate change to see if that's true, and it typically is. It follows the state rate pretty closely. And if we see, now there have been years that we had a bit of a decline in that chart, you can see. But generally speaking, we've had about a 2.88% increase since 2000 to now in the state 1%. Average annualized. The local is kind of harder to pick off because of the rate changes, but you can back into that pretty easily, and it's pretty consistent with that rate growth. That answer your question?
I'll pursue it after the meeting.
Okay, fair enough.
Andrew?
Yes.
Kind of what I think maybe Ms. Smith was asking, because it's kind of what the question that she made me think of. Are you able, from those numbers, are you able to tell how much of those sales are coming from our local population versus like local stores that are selling online to somewhere in Illinois that the local sales tax will come back here for? Does that make sense? Are you able to differentiate that?
No, we can't. We don't have that data. We know what the stores are doing. We know what their sales figures are. We don't necessarily know who their customers are, and then if their online sales are another kind of whole other area to be kind of discussing. But no, we haven't got that detail.
Okay.
Food and beverage. Also, it's always been a fairly strong growing revenue source. As you can see here, we never had really a decrease ever. We've had a couple flat years. This year was relatively stable year to year in terms of the growth. We continue to watch this one. It's been rated positive for many years, and we continue to watch it going forward, but it tends to always have a bump up every single year. Total expenditures, again, this is similar to the chart that we saw for revenue. It just breaks out for the council and the community, kind of a sense of where the most of spending is. A large part of the spending, as it goes where you'd imagine, the public safety, which of course is police, fire, and inspections, and then beyond that, culture and recreation, water, community development, and so forth. General government, that piece there is where we have a lot of our contractual agreements. That's where we fund a lot of our debt service. We also keep all of our core departments there, finance, HR, IT, mayor and council, city manager's office, and so forth. This chart shows general fund personnel costs as a percent of actual total general fund costs. As you can see, that's ranged from 70 to 64%. Over the last few years, it has been coming down. A lot of that has been the staff cuts recently that we've had. We show this in a lot of ways. We rate it as positive. Again, personnel expense for a government is probably its most significant expense, at least reoccurring significant expense. Compared to capital, that might be one time and so forth. So we like to measure that year to year to see where it's at, and it has dropped off into the last couple of years in compared to overall expenditures, which we find is positive. Overlapping debt. This, of course, is the overall debt for the entire community, and when I mean that, I mean Unit 5's debt, our debt, the airport's debt, community college debt, the county debt, all combined to one overall debt picture compared to the assessed value. In this terms, you can see that it's dropping off, which we also rate as positive. This is a function of the EAV growth and a function of how much debt's being paid off, how much debt's being reissued. There's up and down of that all the time. We're paying debt off. We may be issuing debt. Unit 5 may be doing the same thing. But generally speaking, the overall overlapping debt of the community is dropping off compared to the overall, I guess, tax base of the EAV, which we see as a good thing. This is just the town's actual debt per fiscal year. You can see we held fairly steady in terms of the debt since 2010. We did have a bond issue, a couple bond issues in 15 and 16, and then since then we have not issued any new money bond issues. We've been paying debt down since then. We like to see that obviously decreasing every single year, so we rate this as positive. But if you think we're never going to issue debt again, then that's going to happen in the future for certain core projects that the council approves and approves the debt issue. But right now we're kind of in debt payoff mode, if you will, and then obviously planning for any kind of future debt that might be coming down the pipe. Right now it's being paid down, which we see as positive. General fund cash balance, a nice bump up this year. You can see there in 2018, we had a bit of a drop off. That was kind of a tough year, a deficit year. We were coming off of a difficult budget cycle. A variety of things were problematic for us that I won't go into detail. We've already discussed those things in the past. This year, we had more than expected revenue performance for income tax and sales tax we weren't expecting. We also had some budget savings in terms of expenses, so that all falls to the bottom line and essentially increases general fund cash. This is a good number to be. This tells us where we're at in terms of going forward for the budget cycle, and this serves as a nice document to say kind of where we stand cash-wise. Okay, so pension plans. Yeah, a lot to discuss here. I won't go into a lot of detail unless the council wishes. Pam had mentioned the funding formula. We had a bit of a drop-off, just a small drop-off for police, and then for fire, a small pickup. Again, we're holding steady, I guess is the best I can say it. The council is well aware of what we've done in the past in terms of a recap. The funding level, as Pam mentioned, is employer contribution, employee contribution, and interest earnings. Interest earnings is by the lion's share the largest amount that's contributed over the life of a retiree. The portion from the employee is fixed per state statute and code, so what makes up the difference is the employer contribution. The employer contribution comes from our revenue source to fund it. We have, in the last couple of years, reduced our assumptions for interest earnings, as this council is aware. It's not a pleasant thing to do because it hits your bottom line and it hits the contribution from the employer. But it's been a necessary thing to do. We're on the, I guess not on the fence, but we're looking at that now. We're at 6.75 right now. That's not terribly out of line. We're not quite hitting that every year. And that's been part of the problem, why you continue to see kind of a struggle, if you will, on that funding level. We always fund above the minimum, which is 90% by 2040. The town funds at 100% by 2040. But even with that extra, as 2040 gets closer, we are struggling like any municipality on that. I'm sorry, is your question?
Is the actuary requiring us to extend the longevity forecast for the retirees, or is a lot of it being driven by that interest rate assumption?
They look at quite a few assumptions: mortality table, disability, payroll, interest rate earnings. Interest is probably the most significant one when they change that. Now they do update the other assumptions quite a bit, and they do what they call an expectation review, where they look at what they expected to what actually happened, and if their parameters are met, they'll kind of keep it. But they always update for the most recent available tables. The interest assumption rate is one that we completely control, and we tell them what to do on that. They're happy to take our recommendation. They also give us a recommendation on what might be expected. They understand the push-pull of that, in terms of if you do increase or decrease interest earnings rate, you are essentially saying we're going to have to fund more from our coffers, and that is that's going to be a tax increase or some form of revenue to be needed for that. So it's a big push-pull. I can say that and with all the truthfulness, the council's done everything it can to deal with this issue. And it'll be a long-term struggle. I mean, these are not long-term liabilities; they're forever liabilities that we need to manage. And we will be coming forward to you during the property tax cycle to discuss this at length more. But it is a challenge that we face, that every municipality faces in Illinois. Some are worse than us. There are some that are better than us. No doubt about it. But like I said, the council's gotten in front of this. We've done everything we can to find a solution. It's just a balancing act in terms of trying to find where to fund this and how to fund it, and when it's appropriate to change assumptions.
Mr. Hune?
Yes.
What about the assumption on the 100% by 2040? If we were to back that off, how much would that help relieve the pressure?
I haven't got that at my fingertips, but I think in the past, and we've looked at that, and I can look at it again as part of the process this year to give options available. I think it was probably $200,000 per plan from 90 to 100% funding. And there's a lot going on here at the state level, as City Manager Reese mentioned. There's and you've probably heard this more than I have, there's a lot of discussion about consolidation in terms of the pension plans. There's a lot of discussion about refinancing the time period from 2040 to 2050 or further, and even discussing changing the assumption from 90 to 80%. I've heard everything. So there's a lot of activity going on with that. We need to, part of me thinks we need to wait a bit to find out where that all falls out, because that will drive a lot of our policy decisions or what we recommend to you. But we're going to move forward with our current policy, which is 100% funding by 2040, and then discuss options, and then wait for the state to give all of us some kind of guidance on where to go with that.
I will add that the Illinois Municipal League, this is their number one issue, is pension consolidation in police and fire.
Sure.
There are hundreds of funds out there, and we have one IMRF fund, and we see the result of that consolidated pension fund and what it can do. Again, number one priority for Illinois Municipal League is to get bills through the legislature that would consolidate those funds.
Right. Yep, I followed that too, and I think there is certainly some merit to that consolidation that needs to be discussed at the state level. And
Andrew, also in terms of timing, can you share with council, typically we come to council with the recommended tax levy in November.
Correct.
So that's when we will be talking further about how that pension funding rate impacts the property tax levy.
Right. Yeah, we come once to essentially ask for permission to prepare the levy, and we'll have you recommend a levy at that meeting. And then we come back again the next meeting or 2 meetings after that to validate and to formally approve it. And we need to get to that levy to the county by the last Tuesday of December, so we kind of back into that date.
And I'd like to, if I could real quick, take this opportunity to thank Mr. Hune and the finance staff. I have to leave the meeting now. I got married on Saturday, and my wife of 2 days is my favorite normal constituent, and I promised her I would leave between 8:30 and 8:45. So thank you to the finance team, and I'll be going back to her. She's going back to work tomorrow.
Congratulations.
Congratulations, Scott.
Last pension fund to talk about is IMRF, which has come up a couple times tonight, and I wanted to kind of reiterate the impact of changing an assumption, and we have seen that over our tenure with our pension plans. IMRF had a extreme, does pretty well in terms of investing. They are not as restricted as police and fire pension plans are in their investing pool. They generally do perform a little better, and also have basically a bigger portfolio to select from. We all hit about 91% last year, which was nice to see. They had a remarkable investment year that year, and I think all municipalities that participate in IMRF saw some funding level increases. And then, wow, and this year we dropped down to 79.7, and that was, I mean, I knew it was coming, and when the numbers came, bore that out. That is all entirely due to their change in assumptions they went from 7.5% funding assumption for investment to 7.25. So a 25-point basis drop hits us that hard. Now, again, it's something they wanted to do. I think the timing of it made sense because they saw a good funding level for every municipality. They wanted to go ahead and kind of bite that bullet now and move forward. But again, these are challenging decisions to make because they do have a financial impact on us. And we are going to see rate pressure from that because now we accept the fact that we can't earn as much, or they do, and we still want to be 100% funded by a certain deadline, although they've kind of modified that a little bit in their own formula. It needs to be funded, and it's going to be a hit to our contribution. It feels like all bad news for the last few slides.
If I may.
Sure.
You know, when you talk about the percent, that is what they're estimated to be earned, but the actual performance can exceed that and has exceeded it.
Correct.
To provide to the funding level.
Correct. Yeah, what they're trying to estimate there and what we try to estimate with our own pension plans is what we expect to earn over the next 20, 30 years. Similar to just a retirement fund, or a stock market. Well, you estimate, sort of 8% over like 10 years, but you might have a bad year and a good year. It depends on where it's at. And there's some smoothing that goes on in terms of that calculation to keep the changes smoother in terms of year to year. But that's correct. Yeah, it can go down. Water fund. I'm not going to spend. I feel like I'm taking a little bit of your time tonight, and I want to be efficient. Water fund is in good condition. We're going into the budget season with a pretty strong balance. Obviously, there's going to be needs there that we need to deal with, but that fund is in pretty good shape, both from a fund balance perspective and revenue perspective. Sewer, same story. Of course, this is all a result of the council passing the rate structure last year. Went into effect in October 2017. I guess more than last. No, it was quite a while ago. Time flies. So that's helped the fund in terms of restore its financial viability long term, both for operations and more importantly, capital. There's been a long-term capital plan put into place, which you've heard about also in terms of the sewer master plan. That's going to be implemented now over the next few years. It already has started. So that fund is essentially set up for more success, both operationally and more importantly, or probably equally importantly, is infrastructure-wise. We can start to do a lot more projects there in terms of televising the sewer systems to fix the ones that are old. And I have an accountant's knowledge of this information, so I don't want to express too much, but we have money there to support the system. Health dental fund. This one is obviously not a great story and a challenging one to kind of unravel and mitigate. As you can see, we've had some rough years in the health and dental fund. This shows the history for the last 10 years, and you can see there, generally speaking, it's been a pretty stable fund. What's happened over the last few years is the question, and we know what's happened. We're trying to address it now. To give you some background in terms of claims review, Well, let me back up. So this is going to be a summary of the information. Our HR staff, our admin, and with support from HR and finance and our consultants, we do a pretty deep dive on claim activity, what's happening. So in large part, what's going on are essentially two things. One, we're seeing an extremely high utilization of specialty drugs, and this is something that we're seeing across the nation, according to our consultants. And kind of hand in hand with that, we're seeing claims that are associated with serious medical conditions that we are starting to see occur a little bit, and those tend to continue. So in terms of a kind of a high-level claim review, just from plan year 13 to plan year 19, we had about a 60% increase in costs. So that's put a lot of pressure on that fund in terms of fund balance draining. In terms of service type, to break that cost out, professional services, which are kind of office visits, up about 5.4% a year. Inpatient hospital up 5% a year. Outpatient 9.6% a year. This is over that plan year 13 to 19. But by and large, the big one is the pharmacy spend, the drug spend, 22.3% a year. Very significant to absorb that in a fund and then react to it. In terms of more detail on that, you can see here, this is just graphically representing what you just saw on the previous page, professional, inpatient hospital, outpatient, and pharmacy. Pharmacy by far has just ramped up exponentially. And where is that coming from? Well, that's the use of specialty drugs. To give you even more detail on this, so in terms of our spend over that period of time, in 2013, the overall spend for non-specialty versus specialty was 80-20. And when I say non-specialty, I mean antibiotics, cholesterol medicine, kind of these normal reoccurring things that you would see. Specialty drugs are drugs that are basically life-saving drugs for very serious conditions. That is, and they are not inexpensive. And you can see here our spend went from $148,000 in plan year 13 just 6 years ago to over $1 million. So that's a sharp increase, and that is, for the most part, what's creating the problem in terms of the health fund. We are looking at a variety of ways to deal with this. There's been some challenging years, and I'm just kind of hitting the surface here in terms of what we're working on, but basically kind of repeating claims that are associated with very serious medical illnesses. The retirees are a big piece of that plan in terms of expense, and specialized medicine and drugs are also creating. And none of these things are going to go away, according to our Horton, that we've asked them, is there a light in a tunnel? And they said, no, I think we'll continue to see that. Now, the drug spend did flatten out there, $1 million to $1 million last year. Hard to say if that's going to be an anomaly or not, but it is a challenge to control. We continue to invest in wellness. We're looking at plan design changes and other options as we move forward. A lot more to come on this in the budget cycle, though. So we're kind of getting close to wrapping up. I apologize for the length of this presentation. So our last piece is our financial strategies. This, of course, is the council is well aware, and the two new council members. We kind of live and die by these strategies during the budget process. These are our benchmarks. I kind of call it a financial roadmap, per se. We know where we're trying to get. We know the map there, and we know when we're kind of getting off the road a little bit and need to get back on. We evaluate these during the budget process and at year end. Our first one is clearly the most important one is general fund reserve levels. The general fund is, I guess, kind of the center of the universe when it comes to the budget process and our finances. If that's healthy, then we're in pretty strong shape, and the general fund is in a good position. We like to keep 15% liquidity in the fund, which essentially means we have 15% of the money, 15% of total expenditures and transfers is always in the bank account all the time. We are achieving that goal in the current year, the year we just closed, and then the projected years for the out years. So we're going into our budget cycle in a good position, which is nice to have. Equipment vehicle reserve, that's kind of an arm of the general fund, and it's a sinking fund we use for vehicle and equipment purchases. That is also got a reserve requirement, a long-standing reserve requirement. We want that at 75% of average spending for the next 5 years. We're above that in all those targets now, so that's good to go into the budget year with that because there's always going to be needs. Contingency fund levels. This one we don't have money in. It got cut a couple years ago as part of the budget process. We typically would keep about 1% of total spending in essentially a non-departmental account. And it's just there for really two reasons. One, to deal with an unexpected emergency, or two, to take advantage of an opportunity. So, we typically keep that around maybe around $1 million a year, maybe a little less. We had to cut that from the budget to make things balance the last couple of years. I'm pretty hopeful we can probably restore some of that this year. We're going to have to because it's a nice place to go when we need to move some budget authority over to take care of an opportunity or an expense. If not, then we're just basically going into fund balance to solve those problems. So it's kind of one of our first lines of defense, if you will, for challenging times or to exploit an opportunity. Debt management, we have a couple different benchmarks on this. One is keep the total debt payment below 10% of revenue, which we are currently at for all years projected. And then we also maintain what we call as a coverage ratio. There's actually two of them. But the most meaningful one is we keep 1.25% of the projected payment in the books, in the accounts at all times. So essentially what that means is at the beginning of the year, before we even make the debt payment, we already have the entire debt payment plus a quarter of it in reserve. And then we transfer the whole one into the debt. So we always end with at least a year and a quarter of debt service available. And that all years are being targeted for that at this time. We discussed already at length the health insurance fund. We have it as a negative. It's going to be a rough year, even the current year we're in. We're going to be certainly discussing this as we have the last couple of years, as we start to see some decreases in fund balance, and we will continue to look at it through this budget cycle. Water, we have two reserve levels for that, or two benchmarks, if you will. Both are in pretty good shape. Water's got a pretty strong operating reserve fund balance, which we're going to need because there's always capital needs that will be put into the budget for the 5 years coming up. Water capital is a little bit below that projection in the out years currently, but as we get to the budget process, we can probably manage that because we are at a pretty good reserve level for the operating. But again, we need to get through that process and see where we end. But the point is we're going into it with a pretty strong position. Sewer fund, actually even better. Both the operating reserve and the capital reserve are all good for all years. It's just a matter of time before that starts to get spent down with capital projects and needs. And the council's prepared us for that with the rate cycle a couple years ago. And we are seeing that come to fruition in terms of the position of the fund. And we're going to definitely need that as we go forward. So just a quick summary, and these are just, again, talking points. Community indicators, I mark as fair, only fair because, we're still waiting for something to come back. Assessed growth is not quite as what we wanted. Some of the housing prices new homes are a bit low, but existing homes are staying pretty solid. Ridership is up for the airport. Amtrak slightly down, but not a problem. Unemployment rates in good shape. Permits are a bit down. County workforce is down. So we have some issues there to review. I don't want to be an over-alarmist, but we just mark it as fair. Revenue, good to fair. Again, utility tax kind of came back, but it's still a challenging revenue source. Income tax can be a problem in terms of what the state might do. Sales tax is moving along well. They're all steady growth, so we'll see how we look in the new year. Debt service is fine. Fund levels are good. Strategies are also good. We have a couple we want to fix. We want to get some contingency dollars in the budget, and we want to mitigate some of the losses we're seeing in the health and dental fund, which we're working on now. So, generally speaking, we're in a good position with obviously a few things we need to deal with, which is pretty typical of where we're at around this time. Upcoming budget, again, just to recap, last year we had a deficit in 17-18, but it was better than we expected. We ended the year with a pretty strong surplus in 18-19 due to some unexpected increases in sales tax and income tax, and utility tax came in a little better than we expected, of course. And also, again, we always perform pretty well in budget in terms of expenses. We always have some savings there, either through vacancy or programmatic changes or operating savings that always fall to the bottom line, and we just rebudget that in the next year as appropriate. And then we're projecting, it's pretty early for 1920. We'll see it so far. Things are looking okay for the major revenues, with the exception of utility tax, which is struggling a little bit. Coming budget year, again, we're hopeful the major revenues remain stable. We're seeing some improvement. We're seeing some stability there. So we'll hope that continues to go through as we monitor this year's performance and estimate the end of this year, the next 5 years. The state's going to be a complication for us, probably indefinitely, with state income tax, cuts, and they've had some other things, and then also their charges to collect our local sales tax. They've made it a little better, but it's still a problem. So they're always going to be a bit of a harbinger in there in terms of trouble. We have a lack of contingency funds. There are going to be some significant capital funding needs that we have out there. These are kind of pay-as-you-go capital needs that we're going to try to work into the budget this year. I know City Manager Reese has mentioned that a couple times and during different meetings. So we're looking at that now, at ways to fund capital. This would be capital that's not related to debt payments or debt capital. And then our pension funding level, we're never going to ignore that, and we always need to be watching it pretty closely. So all in all, we ended the year well. We're moving into the budget season with a pretty good balance sheet. But as you can see from the report, we're not without issues that we need to resolve and deal with. That is all I have for you, unless you have comments or questions. I apologize for the length of that presentation, though.
No. Thank you. Always very. I'll be right with you, Mr. Nord. Just wanted to give you kudos, you and your department and all the staff members who have worked really, really hard to do this. It's an incredibly good document for us, the general public, to get an overview of kind of take the temperature of our financial community here. Mr. Nord.
Just a couple questions. Last week, Governor Pritzker sent out a memo saying that he was asking for the reductions of the budgets by 6% and some, I understood, consolidation and reductions. How does that affect the town of Normal?
It's really hard to say. It's a state mandate or he's pursuing. We can't speak to how that might impact us, other than if the state gets tighter, that could be problematic for us, but it's hard to say how that would translate.
Does that mean that the revenues coming from the state, we should expect to shrink up as well?
Right now, what we get from the state is the state shared sales, 1% sales tax, which they've given us and never touched. The income tax, they get that they have cut that in the past. They went from 10 to 5%, so they've restored a little bit of the cut, but that's always available, unfortunately, to them to change that formula to keep more of that income tax. The MFT formula has pretty much been set, but those could all change with legislative action. So again, we're always at the mercy of the state's whim on financing. It's not something we necessarily plan for, but when we hear about it, we certainly prepare ourselves budgetarily to deal with it.
Okay.
Mr. Nord, if I could add to that, the Illinois Municipal League, that's another very strong issue, and they're lobbying very strongly to keep that rate that the state is taking from us and actually working harder to lower that. It's a very high priority, and a lot of municipalities are on board on that, saying that, they're taking too much money of monies that they agreed to give us. And so there's a very, very active lobbying going on and working with the legislators to not do anything with that would harm cities.
Sure. I mean, with the exodus from the state, there are simply less people, so they may have their hands tied anyway. But the TIF is going to end in a few years. When it ends, where will the funding come from for the bonds that are outstanding for that?
We'll have to remodel things to accommodate that, and we've known about that for a long time. We're working on different options to manage that as we go forward.
Okay, but it's likely not going to come from the TIF properties because the TIF has ended.
Correct.
Okay. Illinois' got the highest property tax rates in the nation. So whenever we were talking about that, we had positive outlooks for our property taxes compared to other cities in Illinois. It just kind of struck me that we are the highest taxed in the nation, and that we're looking at our property taxes and considering them in a positive light, where from the taxpayer's point of view, it's not positive. And the same when we're talking about increasing revenues by increasing taxes, from the taxpayer's point of view, any increase in tax is hard on them. You know, there's already enough of a reason to, well, leave Illinois for less taxes. And just when we talk about it, it's another thing that strikes a chord with me. Raising taxes may be good for the financial outlook of the city, but for the taxpayers, they view it completely the opposite. Thank you, though, for the report. It was very very informational.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed it, as always.
Before taking a motion for adjournment, are there concerns or comments? Mr. Nord?
Do you want to go first? Okay.
Mr. Nord, we'll get to everyone.
Okay. Mine has to do with Connect Transit, but first I'd like to finish hearing what Mr. Taratilli was going to talk about Connect Transit, because it may address what I was going to say. So if I may, can I invite him up? Is that protocol? Or is that proper or allowed?
No, that is not. This is a business meeting and not a public hearing, and we had our public comment. It's not to hear what Mr. Taratilli has to say about this or any other citizen, but we don't, unless you wanted to make a motion to suspend the rules and allow public comment, we could do that.
I'd like to make a motion to suspend the rules and make public comment to finish hearing what Mr. Taratilli had to say.
I would second that motion.
Please call the roll on that.
Mrs. Cummings?
No.
Mr. Nord?
Aye.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz?
No.
Mr. McCarthy?
No.
Mayor Kus?
No. Continue.
Okay. Connect Transit. Having a bus system is not a profit center for the taxpayers. Regardless of if they use the system or not, the more people who use the system, the more it costs taxpayers. I presume the original reason Bloomington Normal took over the bus system was because those who needed it had few options, if any, without service. Fast forward to today, the economy and service offerings have changed dramatically. Those who can afford transportation have options. There's taxis, there's several private ride services. Those with limited financial means or have mobility challenges, which require ADA accessible vehicles, are more reliant on our public transit system. Unfortunately, our public transit system appears to be trying to compete with the private sector for those riders who can afford to pay the market rate for transportation and removing services from those who need it most. Government should not be competing with the private sector for those who can afford alternative transportation. Every ride the bus provides costs the taxpayers far more than what the rider pays. Private businesses are more efficient. Government cannot and should not compete with the private sector if they can provide the service for less money. When government competes with the private sector, it is unfair to taxpayers. Government does not pay property taxes. They don't pay sales taxes and many other taxes. In fact, Connect can only financially exist by taxing the citizens who don't even ride the bus. Connect's focus has drifted from serving our lower income and mobility challenged individuals. These individuals have been speaking to Connect. Their voices have been ignored in the community. And these are the very people that the bus system was intended to support. This council oversees Connect with the help of the Bloomington Council. Unfortunately, there are not currently enough council members, normal council members, or mayor who are willing to exercise the oversight provision and step in to help the most vulnerable citizens in our community. Earlier this year, an individual within the Normal Township government went on record stating the Connect board should be replaced. Since this request was made, I have tried to reason with Connect. I have tried to understand why they removed services from our trailer parks and moved access further away from our hospitals and medical clinics than where they were just a short time ago. I have asked them to serve the most vulnerable in our community as a priority. They have refused. They have doubled down and have increased service to those who can afford alternatives. And they have asked taxpayers for more money. They are asking for town oversight to be removed, and they want to become their own taxing body. I now understand why she came to the conclusion that the board needs to be replaced. If Connect becomes a taxing body, it will allow a broken system to further increase the property taxes of every property owner within their purview. This power to increase taxes would just throw more good money after bad and would be a travesty for the citizens this council is supposed to support, or is supposed to represent. At a time when all this is going on, the citizens of Normal have an open seat on the Connect board, reserved for them, and this seat remains unfilled. It has been unfilled for nearly a year. And at this time, this is when the citizens need as much representation as they possibly can. And they should not be denied their full representation on the Connect board. Why this position is unfilled doesn't matter any longer. The citizens deserve and should have representation. It is a shame one individual can intentionally hold up the progress of citizen representation within our local government for so long. The citizens of Normal deserve a policy to allow any duty to be performed in the event that one person refuses to do their elected duty. I have asked before, and I will continue to represent the citizens of Normal and ask, Mr. Mayor, please appoint someone to the Connect board who will represent the citizens of Normal. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Norden. I'm going to take that as your opinion and not the voice of this council. I think we've been over that ground many times before. I will address the issue you talked about, which I did to you privately, and I will do it publicly, that it was my intention to fill that board position if a candidate stepped forward that I felt would step in, otherwise step in a profound role. Otherwise, I was waiting for this working group to finish their work. If there were significant issues coming up in terms of budget going forward that required full representation, I would put that person on. I will tell you that the candidate pool has not been that strong, and I had a candidate that this board would unanimously approve, but that person, because of personal reasons, couldn't step forward to do that work at this point. It's not that I'm ignoring this or playing politics with this, but again, the toxicity going into this situation with the work group and that, I feel severely diminished the candidate pool. I was told by a couple of candidates or potential candidates exactly that. They said, I'm not going to get in the middle of this mess right now. So that was my reasoning. Mr. McCarthy.
A couple of things. Many of the comments that my colleague just made about Connect Transit were addressed when Connect Transit was here. And some of these statements are just not accurate, and maybe at some point we need to have Connect Transit come back and revisit. Connect Transit has not asked for the removal of oversight. That never happened. There's a central thing, if I heard you right, Mr. Nord, maybe you can help me out, that the bus system was created to give options to those that have none. Is that what you stated the reason was for the creation of the bus system? I thought I typed that, but tell me if I misrepresented what you said.
No, not that that's what the bus system was created for, but that's what, well, I could go back and read exactly what it was, but the purpose of the bus system is to, first and foremost, help those that need transportation, whether they cannot financially afford it or physically cannot drive.
So you didn't say the bus system was created to give options, or that the town and city took over the system? I want to make sure I have that right.
I presume the original reason Bloomington Normal took over the bus system was because those who needed it had few options, if any, without the service.
Okay. So I was a little off in my wording. Thank you. I appreciate that. I want to weigh on this because this has been an interesting conversation. I've gotten some feedback back on both sides of this issue a little bit on the Connect Transit as I've waded into this topic and start to talk about residents proactively. You know, my grandma used to say something to me when I was a kid, little 5 foot tall, feisty woman. It wasn't her line, but she repeated it often. She said, if you want some milk, don't sit yourself in the middle of the field waiting for the cow to back up. And so I've been out asking people about their opinions on some of this rather than trying to shape it, simply asking questions about this. And there seems to be a very diverse opinion about the statement that the bus system is for only a very small segment of our population, that tax dollars being created and diverted from a large set of people to a small set of people was never an intention for a public service, like it's being suggested. The redistribution of wealth essentially has been something that's been talked about in different tax policies and strategies for a long period of time, but rather that a public transit system is intended to be for the entire public, not a small segment of the public. And certainly increased ridership means increased use and increased costs, but it also means increased revenue. And if able-bodied riders are the largest segment, why would we choose to alienate the largest fare-paying population in favor of the most subsidized rider population? Financial strategy, straight up, makes no sense from funding a transit system with money that's received in the fare box. Also, so recap, public transit is intended to be for all. Also, there's a lot of motives about why why Connect Transit is doing pollution, sustainability, economic development, choice, convenience. All of those are motives for why the change. But most specifically, what we heard when Connect Transit was here, route changes were based on data, information collected about route utilization, about the number of riders. One such trailer park up in North Normal, speaking with our representatives and staff at Connect Transit, that a route was eliminated because low utilization rates, and there was some opposition to that change. Well, for about 6 months, they sent small buses up. Didn't advertise it, but they sent them up to see what ridership, and ridership was almost zero. And so after they made a change, they wanted a test to make sure, and these routes, that one action proved out that ridership level was in fact correct, that there was very little. And so these aren't random decisions that are being made. Route changes have happened. The Connect Transit has had a very methodical, very data-driven, very analytics approach to trying to understand ridership and where it is and where it isn't, and where they invest their resources. And so if Mr. Mayor, I'm going to ask if we're going to continue to one-sided make statements and attack our transit system, that we give the transit system with the data and the facts the opportunity periodically to come back and present the actual facts and the actual data behind their actions, rather than one-sided attacks on it. I just don't think that that's fair. That happens at a council meeting. The other things I really wanted to talk about, the CAFR. Mr. Hune and your team, thank you, congratulations, another fine job. Taking an amazing amount of information and condensing it down to something readable and consumable is very, very difficult. And this is one of my most favorite meetings. I'm geeky that way. I have so many tabs on this book from looking at it so much. I really, really appreciate it. Just a couple of highlights that I wanted to point out. One is I'm very happy to see our sewer fund doing what it is. That was one that weighed heavy on my mind, and I know other members on this council for a number of years, that we virtually didn't have much money in case emergencies happened and to invest in the infrastructure. So I'm very excited to see that infrastructure balance is up for us to be able to continue to invest in that area of our community and do the repair and replacement. Also, I know it's negative. I'm very excited about the airport. That change in trend and the airline carrier is making a difference. And if you're traveling in and out of Sierra at all, I've noticed this. I've talked to other people and other business travelers that I work with directly are noticing a shrinking of the gap between pricing at Sierra and our other regional competitors, that Sierra is becoming way more competitive than it has been. So if you haven't, give Sierra a try. check them out. They've got some very competitive pricing going on, and shop local, fly local if you can, because they're doing a great job out at Sierra. I appreciate that.
And not to take away from your comment on Sierra, but they have so little impact on the rates of
Yeah, of course.
flying in and out of the community. It's a Byzantine pricing model out there in the airline world, as we have seen. Anyone who flies has seen that happen. Ms. Lorenz.
Yes, thank you. You know, I made a note during the comments from one of our speakers, Mr. Teratilli, that I wondered how it was that he knew that Connect Transit was going to come up during the comments. So while perhaps we didn't hear directly from him, I noticed, Mr. Nord, you read from a script, and I just kind of wonder in my mind if we didn't hear from Mr. Teratilli tonight. It's a rhetorical question. Thank you.
Ms. Smith.
I had the chance to follow up with the auditor and with Mr. Weber from PGAV about their presentation last week. And given that we are moving into financial planning for the upcoming year, I wanted to, rather than focus on the positives exclusively, highlight the fact that we are entering some uncharted territory as we are in the 11th year of an expansion which is unprecedented, and that WGLT themselves reported that McLean County farmers are the largest recipients of farm subsidies in the current crop cycle. The tariffs are continuing to provide a level of uncertainty, and while the town of Normal is meeting its challenges, the town of Normal does not operate in a vacuum, and that I think we need to be cautious as we plan for the upcoming fiscal year. But I also wanted to point out that from my understanding, that the focus on the TIF and highlighting how wonderful the TIF is was dwelling on the dollars spent to fund from principal of the bond the investment in the buildings themselves, with an emphasis of what was being spent by the community for direct investment. It ignored the matching dollars that were funded by state and local grants. Now, those dollars granted were triggered because we did provide for this TIF. But in funding those state and local grants, taxpayer dollars went into providing for those dollars. And while that was not direct taxation, it is coming out of citizens' pockets. And I think it is a disservice when we consider as free money something that is not directly paid by our local dollars. And that as a community, as a state, as a country, we need to recognize that the funding that goes into providing for government services is all coming from taxpayers, and that we should therefore look at them in total. And while, yes, on the balance sheet, it was a $90 million local tax investment that funded the TIF. If you factor in those other dollars, it included 43% that was government funding of a public-private partnership, and that we need to take a look at when will the community be so attractive that government can step back, and that the business community at large will be willing to make the investment on their own without our dollars. The TIF ideas date back more than 20 years and were designed originally, as my understanding is with talking with Mr. Weber, by a consultant from the Chicago area. 20 years is a generation. That as we move forward, there have been interviews in the community emphasizing not just Trail East, but discussion of Trail West, Trail South, the overpass, underpass, whatever it will be, the sports complex. I would hope that as we're looking at this larger picture, that everything goes on the table for a revised discussion and revisit those projects in total to recognize that we may now have a different generation of people in our community interested in these projects with a difference of opinion about what should be done going forward. And I hope that more conversation rather than less is permitted to allow us to plan our future going forward. Thank you.
I would just add a couple of comments on your statements, most of which I do agree with. The one would be that we did get significant grant dollars from the federal government, and these are dollars that you as a taxpayer pay, whether it's motor fuel taxes, income tax, whatever. And those monies go to the federal government to fund their operations, and some of those monies are returned. And when you take a look at that formula for many years now, Illinois is what's considered a donor state. We send more money to Washington than comes back to us in that regard. And somehow I don't think we're the state taking a state position. We're representing our position very well by doing that. There are other states that are smaller than us. I won't name them. Well, sure I will. Utah is one, for instance, who gets significantly more transportation dollars than the state of Illinois does. And that's the federal governmental process. The other point I will make, TIF is one of the few tools we have in the state of Illinois to incent economic development. States around us write checks. Texas and Arizona come to mind in that regard for businesses to come or to do projects in their state. And so TIF is one of the things that helps us level the playing field. We could choose not to do TIFs and put our community in a vacuum and say anything that's going to happen in our community is going to happen organically from the business community without the benefit of government. And I can tell you that businesses will go elsewhere, because this is a tool that is used throughout the United States. Mostly, there are some states that don't have it, but is used by municipalities all over this country to grow businesses in their community. To take the long-term approach, it generates dollars for the community locally. It may not in the first 5 years, but in a 10, 15, 20-year outlook, it generates dollars for the community.
Respectfully, Mr. Mayor, but in my notes from Mr. Weber's presentation, he emphasized that a successful TIF is one built on private investment, and that philosophically, at some point, it should reach the level where the government can step back, because the community is so attractive that it, on its own, is attracting businesses to invest.
And I know you're not saying that we generated no private dollars in this effort.
I am not.
Thank you.
I am simply saying that if we are doing such a good job, we have to have the confidence in what we are as a community to give the business community at large the opportunity to make their investment without any incentive at all.
Thank you. We could go back and forth on that. I'd be happy to do that over a cup of coffee someday. Motion
I might
for
need some Irish in it.
I just wanted to comment to Mr. McCarthy. Whenever I first got involved in the Connect conversation, my thoughts were exactly as you mentioned when I first talked with Connect, that yes, they did have a bus. And then I was told that they took it away because of lack of ridership. But then I talked to the folks in that neighborhood, and I would welcome you to talk with them too, and I can give you contact information. Because what happened that I came to discover was they got the bigger buses. The bigger buses could not go in to the neighborhood, so they moved the bus stop down the street. And one of the residents who walked that far, there was no sidewalks. The folks that are disabled in wheelchairs, they could not go down the street. This is Linden Avenue north of Rab Road. I mean, it's a fairly fast-moving road. It just was not safe. So people did not use that service. Then the tripper service that you're talking about, the tripper service, it sounded good when I first heard about it, but then I found out how that service worked. The bus came in the morning to pick people up. And then the bus would return in the evening to bring them home. So imagine someone having to go to the doctor's office for like a 1 o'clock appointment, having to get up in the morning, get on the Tripper bus to go many hours ahead of the appointment, getting their appointment, and then coming home many hours later. That service, it just was not convenient enough for it to work. That's why the Tripper service didn't work. So I will forward you on some contact info, because everything I've learned has been from the people that have been affected. And I just want to share what the community has reached out to me and what I have learned.
Mr. McCarthy?
Thank you. I appreciate that information. So I guess my point is a couple things. Is one is if we're going to be calling out Connect Transit and their decision making, that we invite them back for the opportunity to reshare some of the information. That was most of my point. The second point, and I just want to remind everybody in the community, if there's folks that are disabled, there is a special service called Connect Mobility. And that is available to everybody, no matter where they are. That bus comes right into your, very close or to your individual property. So it's not that there is no service available to those that have that need. There is, in fact. It's called Connect Mobility. And it's available to anybody in the community that qualifies for that service. Forgive me, I don't qualify for that service. I don't know what all the standards are for that, but that does exist. So Tripper, no Tripper, big bus, no big bus, there are services available. I guess the last thing I want to say, and I don't know this is appropriate, I don't want to go back and forth debating this, but my main point is that if we're looking for factual information about why Connect Transit did and made changes, then let's invite Connect Transit, who made those decisions, and why and how they made those decisions, and if we need a refresher on that, rather than making assertions that aren't based on their actual decision process. That's my point here. I don't want to go back and forth, point to point with you. I'm happy to sit down after or on another time and discuss this further, but I think we owe Connect Transit the opportunity to talk about their process themselves.
Did you have a comment? We're not going to go back and forth on this, but
it's not to go back and forth. This is just for public education. The Connect Mobility service, it does not cost as much as the fixed route service. Many of the folks that are disabled, they literally have $70 a month to spend in disposable income. A trip that on the fixed route bus would be $1, or even discounted. On the mobility service, they may pay $6 to $7 round trip. And when they only have $70 of disposable income, these are our most vulnerable. The mobility service is expensive. They have to schedule a day ahead. In order to even qualify, they have to fill out paperwork, which may take 60 to 90 days in advance. That's why the mobility service is there, but the cost, it may not sound like a lot to us for say $3 one way, but to someone that literally cannot afford that, that is a huge struggle, and that's what's being missed. But yes, we can definitely talk later about it.
I will definitely point out, these are very, very definite issues that the working group is taking up and discussing. And we should allow them the breathing room to do that. And then we can revisit that as a council, as the city of Bloomington will revisit. But this working group is working through some of these issues and discussing them. They're aware of these issues and are working on it. And we should give them the breathing room to do so. Mrs. Reese.
In addition, just to point out, and I believe all council members are aware that Connect Transit shared at their presentation that they are assisting patrons. They basically have a concierge service to assist individuals with insurance, Medicare, Medicaid reimbursement and such. So, anyone with an interest should be contacting their office to walk through to try to make those Connect Mobility rides affordable. And they mentioned that when they were here, and I think they've even expanded their scope of ability to do that. So just wanted to point that out. The other thing I just wanted to mention on a different subject is we have proudly posted on our website that we are coordinating an event in October 3rd and 4th, in partnership with Heartland Community College and Illinois State and Human Relations Commission and a variety of other folks, that there will be a conference held at Heartland Community College called Daring Diversity 2019, and it is a racial equity summit. It will be October 3rd and October 4th, again at Heartland Community College. There's information on the town's website, www.normal.org, and you can find it on the Residents tab. And it's, again, called Daring Diversity 2019 Racial Equity Summit. The whole itinerary is on the website, and it will prove to be a very, I think, a very productive dialogue with folks and discussing very important topics.
Thank you. And before taking the motion for adjournment, I'm just going to point out a life-changing experience for Mr. Preston and congratulate him on finding a woman that is compatible to him and probably, I won't say smarter than him, but congratulations. I'm not saying this well, I know, but congratulations, Mr. Preston and Ally. Motion for adjournment.
So moved.
Second.
Please call the roll.
Mr. Nord?
Aye.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye.
Mrs. Cummings?
Aye.
Mayor Kus?
Aye. We are adjourned. Thank you.
Huh. I missed that email.